ever.
Music would fill volumes. As the late, great Will Rogers once noted, we're all ignorant just about different things. Well, I'm ignorant about popular music. That doesn't prevent me from having strong opinions about some of the sounds that explode out of open car windows on these hot summer afternoons, but I'd be astonished if the musicians responsible would either care or pay much attention to what I think. You can only imagine how and where those artists might tell me to deliver any improvements on their work that I might recommend. On the other hand, a bewildering array of actors, directors, comedians, and musicians seem quite earnestly convinced that what the rest of us desperately need is their advice on how to vote in this upcoming presidential election. Having observed the electorate's uncertainty in 9 particularly important battleground states, a star-studded galaxy of musicians, including among them Bruce Springsteen and his E Street Band, are going to bring their talents and their points of view to 40 concerts in 30 cities among those 9 states over the course of 10 days in October. Bruce Springsteen and I will talk about that in a few minutes, but first, my Nightline colleague Michelle Martin has an overview of that heady mix of entertainment and politics.
For John Kerry, it was Bruce Springsteen.
Listening to the sound of the American heart.
For President Bush, it was George Strait. In recent years, campaigns of both major parties have been accompanied by a soundtrack. But this year, some artists and entertainers are taking it a step further, seeking to use their art to affect the outcome of the November election.
Many different people in the public, artists, entertainers, musicians, songwriters, have become more outspoken and more involved than any time, certainly since the 1960s. And I think you could make the argument that they're really more engaged now than they were even in the 1960s.
Today, a group of major music stars announced the Vote for Change tour, set to travel through 9 battleground states in October. Sponsored by the liberal activist group Move On PAC, the proceeds will benefit the organization Americans Coming Together, which is working to defeat President Bush.
I do think that people who are on the fence hopefully will be persuaded by our concern, and hopefully, go out and prove that on November 2nd.
To be sure, conservatives and Republicans also have their cultural champions, like former action hero turned California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Conservatives like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, who also appears on Fox News, dominate talk radio. And some country music performers like Toby Keith have been vocal supporters of President Bush.
There's a confluence of a kind of generational passion and a particular sense of high stakes about this time we live in.
But many of the new efforts to organize artists around the upcoming election appear to come from the left.
I think they feel as though the stakes are high, particularly high this time, and like good liberals have a sort of passionate loathing of this president and his administration.
The conservative media market is growing.
The liberals, when they see how successful the talk radio has become, how successful conservatives have become in putting out books, have seen the rise of the Fox News channel and so forth, they're now starting to see themselves as the embattled minority and completely overwhelmed by what they see as a conservative media onslaught.
Fahrenheit 9/11 is the most obvious example of renewed energy on the cultural left.
This is an impressive crowd, the haves and the have-mores.
But the Hollywood mainstream seems to be making the point, too.
This is a coup.
A recent release features an all-powerful corporation using mind control to win the White House.
This is rich people funding bad science to put a sleeper in the White House.
A disaster movie with a familiar-looking vice president who ignores alarms about global warming.
Mr. Vice President, if we don't act now, it's going to be too late.
And coming this fall, Team America, a satire that lampoons Bush foreign policy.
Junior can't read if he's high on crack.
And Silver City, featuring a dim-witted scion of a political family who runs for governor.
Look, if you're up in a helicopter, airplane, you know, something that flies, you don't want your pilot intoxicated with drugs, do you?
Some artists have learned the hard way that speaking out carries a price.
We were the example for what can happen when you speak out.
The Dixie Chicks, one of country music's best-selling acts, were banned from some radio stations last year after lead singer Natalie Maines criticized President Bush at a London concert. After death threats and lost record sales, they are joining the Vote for Change tour.
And I think there has been this fear that's been looming over artists, you know, not to speak out, and I totally understand why, because we, as the Dixie Chicks, we're threatened for exercising our freedom of speech professionally and personally.
We're citizens, and we're citizens that, that communicate. That's what we do. The idea that artists are unqualified to comment on the society they live in is a relatively new idea that, as far as I know, was invented by right-wing talk radio and this administration. I always thought that was my job.
On the radio, Howard Stern has taken it a step further, virtually ordering his listeners to the polls.
Yeah.
If you're listening to me now, the one thing I ask you to do is vote against Bush. Vote for Kerry.
Dropped from 6 radio stations after complaints by the FCC, he has turned his problems into a crusade against President Bush.
In a very, very close race, if there are Howard Stern fans in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, for example, and they may think, well, you know, he may have a point there. I'm going to vote against Bush.
How's everybody doing out there?
That is, of course, the key question, whether any of this makes a difference.
Russell Simmons!
Music and fashion impresario Russell Simmons, chairman of the Hip Hop Action Summit, believes artists can have a particularly profound impact on one great untapped political resource, the young. There is very little evidence that there's any broad-based movement among, 18 to 24-year-olds more than there was 4 years ago.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what your polls say, but this country is very polarized. There's a lot at stake. And I think young people, certainly the hip-hop community, is motivated, is energized, and your polls are wrong.
The polls show that young people are actually less likely to be registered to vote than they were 4 years ago. But those who are registered say they are watching the race more closely and are more certain to vote. But that is true across the board, a sign that rather than changing any minds, artists who speak out this year may be preaching to the choir.
I can feel your pain!
This is Michelle Martin for Nightline in Washington.
When we come back, Bruce Springsteen tells me why, after 25 years of keeping his political opinions to himself, he has decided to offer them up.
Of course, I'm doing it for the kind of country that I want my kids to grow up in. It's damn straight. Absolutely.
That conversation when we come back.
This is ABC News Nightline.
Are you entitled to your own opinion? Of course you are. But who the hell is Bruce Springsteen to tell anybody how to vote?
This is my favorite question.
I thought it would be.
All right. First of all, I don't think you can tell anybody anything. You ask people to think about things together. Second of all, it's an interesting question that seems to only be asked of musicians and artists for some reason. If you're a lobbyist in Washington, you're a business guy. Well, shut up and do business. Stay out of public policy. Nobody complains about that. If you're in a big corporation, right, you influence the government your way, right? Artists write and sing and think, and this is how we get to put our 2 cents in.
This is clearly not the way you felt most of your professional life. Most of your professional life, you have very carefully, you've spoken out about a lot of issues. When I say spoken out, you've written the songs which express how you feel about a lot of social issues.
Right.
But you've never gone partisan on us.
I stayed a step away from partisan politics because I felt it was always important to have an independent voice. I wanted my fans to feel like they could trust that. But you build up credibility, and you build it up for a reason. Over a long period of time. And hopefully we've built up that credibility with our audience. And I think there comes a time when you feel, all right, I've built this up and it's time to spend some of this. And I think this is one of the most critical elections of my adult life, certainly. Very basic questions of American identity are at issue. Who we are, what do we stand for, when do we fight? As a nation over the past 4 years, we've drifted away from, I think, very mainstream American values. I think that in the question of, hey, we watch tax cuts for the richest 1%. Hey, that's me, you know? It's, you know, it's corporate bigwigs, wealthy, you know, well-to-do guitar players. But we also watch services get cut, after-school programs for the people that need it the most. We watch rollback, environmental regulations, and a foreign policy that I think put at risk the lives of the very bravest young men and women under what's ended up to be discredited circumstances. I feel the nation is in danger of devolving into an oligarchy. These are issues I've written about my whole life. Probably since my late 20s I started to think about it, you know? And I've had plenty of quarrels with past administrations. And if you go back to when I grew up during the Vietnam, and you see, hey, the Democrats are in the White House, the Gulf of Tonkin, we were misled into the Vietnam War. You know, it's not just a purely Democratic and Republican issue.
40 years ago, last week.
That's right. But what I do believe is I believe that John Kerry and John Edwards, I don't think they have all the answers. Right now, for the problems we have out there, I haven't seen anybody who does, you know.
What is it about Kerry's policy on Iraq that differentiates him from George Bush? What would you point to?
It's not, there is not a great difference at the moment. That's absolutely true.
No difference.
Absolutely true, you know. But I believe that in the area of foreign policy, I feel our president's burned his bridges in a lot of ways. And I feel that he's eroded trust in a large segment of American voters. And that, hey, we need somebody else in there to try and regain some of our stature internationally. I think we need a new face. And I think that'd make a difference. I think that'll make a difference.
If, in fact, he has eroded trust among a significant portion of the American people, why do we need a bunch of rock stars and country western singers to tell us about it?
Well, you know, it's this goes back to our first question. You know,
right.
Number one is hey, we're citizens. You know, we're citizens, and I think that, as I've said, lobbyists, labor unions, farmers, teachers, everybody has a way of putting their input in.
They're you know? Openly and patently doing it for their interests. If I have Company X that makes widgets, I want the legislation out of Congress to be as widget-friendly as it can possibly be.
Right.
What does Bruce Springsteen want? You're not doing it for yourself, are you? Or are you?
Well, I think, of course, I'm doing it for the kind of country that I want my kids to grow up in. It's damn straight. You know, absolutely. I got young sons, you know, and one's 14. He's going to be 18, 19, you know, soon. And I am concerned about our approach to foreign policy.
Is this a pro-John Kerry thing or an anti or anybody but George Bush thing?
Yeah, I like John Kerry and I like John Edwards, you know. It's not I don't believe it's an anybody but Bush thing, you know.
I want to know whether you think this is going to hurt you, but I'll ask you that when we come back. I'm with Bruce Springsteen at his home in New Jersey, and we'll be back in a moment.
I've made some big calls.
I'm at the home of Bruce Springsteen, and we've been talking about this 30 or 40 concert tour that you and a bunch of other famous musicians are going to hold in October, just before the election, in the battleground states, 10 of them.
That's right.
40 cities, 30 concerts?
Some concerts,
Or 30
yeah.
concerts, 40 cities, I forget. But it's a lot of concerts, a lot of cities, And to put it bluntly, it's a late-night broadcast. You're going to piss a lot of people off. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And
we who are about to be lambasted salute you, you know. It's like
is it going to, I mean, is it going to hit you hard?
People really invest themselves in you, and you invest yourself in them. And a part of that bond says, you look into the audience and you see yourself. The audience looks on stage and they see themselves. That's at the core of the rock experience, you know. And I think for a percentage of my audience, this may feel like a severance of that bond. For the most part, I think if you followed me for the past 25 years, or even for a brief amount of time, you have a pretty reasonable idea where I stand on most issues. And we've done things before where there's been controversy. At the song American Skin, you play that song, some people boo it. They cheer the next one. They boo that one. You know, some people, the night we played it, we stood on stage and I received the New Jersey State Salute from a few folks. You know, and
is that a one-finger salute?
Yes, it is. And you know, and so that's part of the whole thing. That's part of the whole thing. And you know, the audience aren't lemmings. They come to you for resource and inspiration, and sometimes they'll come and maybe you'll make them angry, or you'll disappoint them, or you'll inspire, or you'll excite them. And that's how I see my job. And
But your intent here is to do what to them? I mean, obviously you're doing this because you think it's going to make a difference in the election. Otherwise, why do it?
Absolutely. So the tour has a very basic intent. You know, its intent is to change the direction of the government, change administrations in November, to mobilize progressive voters, right? And get them to the polls come election time. So there's a very practical purpose.
Let's talk about the practical part. This was all sort of put together, organized by MoveOn.org.
Mm-hmm. Move On presents it, and America Come Together is a beneficiary of the money we raise.
So we're talking theoretically about some tens of millions of dollars that might be available here at a very critical stage of the election.
Right.
And one of the things that liberal Democrats are complaining about more than anything else in the world is the influence of big money on the political process.
Right.
Right? Well, here we got a lot of big money at the most vulnerable time in the political process. You got any thoughts about that?
Hopefully it will be a substantial sum, you know. And the point is I feel we're going out and we're trying to level the playing field with a lot of the kinds of corporate donations and different things that the Republicans can raise, you know. And the idea is, we are trying to infuse, you know, the campaign with a certain amount of cash at that time. It's going to enable foot soldiers to go out and go door to door and activate voters and get people to the polls. And there's a very specific goal that we feel is worth accomplishing, you know. And so that's really the bottom line as far as I'm concerned.
I suggest that goal is beating Bush.
Yes, it is.
Well, a few minutes ago when I asked you whether it was supporting Kerry or beating Bush, you were on the supporting Kerry side, and my instinct all along has been that maybe what's uniting Democrats this year more than anything else is less a passion for Kerry than as Michael Moore puts it, a white right sock rather than George W. Bush.
You know, well, I think that, you know, in the sense that I think people have been unified by the president's policies in a way that I haven't seen in a long time, you know.
Unified against them.
That's right. That's right.
You're nice to have had us at your home again. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'll be back in a moment. That's our broadcast for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in New Jersey. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
You're watching